John sat on the porch of his ranch, the day winding down with the sun sinking low behind the distant hills. The air was cooling, and the quiet of the plains made everything seem peaceful. His ranch was a place of solitude just as he liked it. He'd worked the land for years, living by his own rules, doing what needed to be done. A solitary life suited him just fine, and he had little patience for drama. But life had a way of surprising him, and today would be no different. He sipped his coffee and leaned back in the old wooden chair, the familiar creaks of the porch swing filling the silence. His thoughts wandered to the day's work, the cattle he'd rounded up and the fences he'd fixed. But his peace was interrupted by a soft, hesitant knock on the door. John's heart skipped a beat. The knock was so faint that he almost wondered if he had imagined it. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans as he moved toward the door. The sound had been so quiet, almost as if it were someone in need. He opened the door, expecting to find a neighbor or maybe a passing traveler. What he didn't expect was a little girl standing on the doorstep, her eyes wide with fear and her small frame shaking. She couldn't have been more than 7, her clothes ragged and stained, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her tiny hands were clenched into fists, and she was holding onto an old stuffed bear so tightly that her knuckles were white. It was as if the toy was her only comfort in the world, a symbol of something safe in the chaos she must have been living through. "He beat my mom, and she's dying," she said, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. John froze, his heart suddenly heavy with concern. The words didn't make sense at first. He wasn't used to hearing such a thing, not in this part of the world. It was a shock to his system, something far beyond the quiet life he had built. The little girl's eyes were filled with terror, and it didn't take long for him to realize this was no ordinary situation. This was a call for help. Without thinking twice, John bent down to her level. He needed to comfort her, to understand what had happened. "Where's your mom, little one?" he asked softly, his voice gentle, trying to calm her. The girl looked down at the ground for a moment, then glanced up at him, her eyes filled with fear and desperation. She swallowed hard before speaking again, her voice shaky. "She's at home, in the cabin. He hurt her real bad. She's dying, mister." John felt his heart drop. He didn't know this child, didn't know her mother, but something deep inside told him that he couldn't leave them out there, alone and vulnerable. The girl's pain was clear in her voice, and it hit him harder than he could have expected. He didn't know how or why it had come to this, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. "Don't worry, little one," he said softly, though his own voice was tight with emotion. "We're going to get your mama some help." He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew he had to act fast. The girl had come to him, knocked on his door, and asked for help. She had no one else to turn to, and he couldn't ignore that. She was just a little girl, and her mom was in danger. It was the kind of situation that required immediate action. And John wasn't one to hesitate when someone's life was on the line. John led the girl inside the house, telling her to wait there while he gathered what he needed. His mind raced as he thought about the situation. There were so many questions. Who had done this to her mother? Why had this happened? John didn't know the answers, but what he did know was that he wasn't going to let anyone suffer on his watch. His ranch may have been his sanctuary, but that didn't mean he was blind to the suffering of others. He had a strong sense of justice, a belief that when someone needed help, you didn't turn them away. He grabbed his old rifle from its place on the wall, checking it quickly. He was no stranger to confrontation, having dealt with the occasional troublemaker in his time. But this was different. This was a desperate situation, and John had to be ready for whatever might come. As he prepared to leave, the little girl watched him with hopeful eyes. She seemed to draw strength from him, even though she was clearly still afraid. Her wide eyes followed his every movement, and when he looked back at her, he saw a glimmer of trust in them. It was a trust he didn't take lightly. "Are you sure you're okay here for a while?" he asked, needing to make sure she was settled before he went. The girl nodded, still clutching her stuffed bear like it was the most important thing in the world. "I'll be okay, just please help my mom." John gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was no time for hesitation. He couldn't waste another minute. With one final glance at the little girl, he stepped outside, locking the door behind him. He mounted his horse with practiced ease, his mind already on the ride ahead. The sun was almost gone now, and the evening sky was tinged with darkening colors. The road ahead was unclear, but the path was set in his mind. He was going to help that woman no matter what it took. The girl had told him her story in fragments, but enough to piece together that something terrible had happened at the cabin where they lived. A man had hurt her mother. The girl hadn't given him much more information, but he didn't need more. He knew that if her mother was still alive, she needed help, and fast. John pushed his horse into a steady gallop, heading toward the cabin. The wind whipped at his face as he rode, his thoughts consumed by the task at hand. He didn't know what kind of man he was about to face, but he knew he was ready. Whatever this man had done, it wasn't going to go unchallenged. John had seen violence before, but the kind of brutality the girl described had stirred something deeper in him. No one deserved that kind of treatment, especially not a woman and child. As he rode on, the rancher made a silent promise to himself. This man would never hurt anyone again. Not while John was around. The journey to the cabin felt like it took an eternity. John urged his horse forward, his thoughts clouded with the fear that the woman might not be alive by the time he reached her. He didn't know what he would find when he arrived, but he wasn't about to give up. The girl had asked for help, and he wasn't the kind of man to let someone down, not when they were depending on him. As the cabin came into view, the wind seemed to pick up, the clouds gathering overhead, adding to the tension in the air. The small rundown building looked even more lonely than usual. The door was slightly ajar, and through the cracks John could see the dim light flickering from inside. It wasn't a welcoming sight. He dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the door. His heart pounded in his chest, and every step felt heavier than the last. The sound of his breathing was louder in his ears, his senses on high alert. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond just the obvious. With a firm push, John opened the door, his hand still gripping his rifle. He stepped inside, scanning the room quickly. The smell of old wood and stale air hit him first, followed by the faint scent of blood. His eyes fell on the woman, lying on a ragged mattress in the corner, her face pale and bruised. The sight stopped him in his tracks. She was still breathing, but just barely, her breath shallow and labored. The man, the one who had done this to her, was nowhere to be seen. That was a relief, at least. But the woman's condition made it clear that time was running out. He couldn't waste another second. John dropped to his knees beside her, checking her pulse and gently tilting her head back to ensure she was still alive. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked softly. Though he wasn't sure if she could respond, she stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping her lips. John's heart sank. He knew she needed help. He needed to act fast. As he checked her injuries, he noticed how carefully she had been treated. Her clothes were torn, and there were bruises and cuts across her arms and face. But she didn't seem to have any serious wounds that would be immediately life-threatening. That was a small relief. At least she wasn't bleeding out. The little girl's voice echoed in his mind. "He beat my mom and she's dying." Those words kept replaying in his head, and John knew he couldn't let that happen. He had to save her. He quickly assessed the situation. The woman needed medical attention, and fast. But he couldn't take her to town, not without risking running into the man again. And he couldn't leave her alone to ride back to the ranch. John had an idea. He would tend to her as best as he could, but he also needed to get her away from this place, away from whatever was left of the danger. John gently lifted the woman, careful not to jostle her too much. He felt her weakness, the way her body seemed to slump against him. She was so fragile, and yet there was still strength in her. He could feel it in the way she held on to him, like she was trying to fight back from the darkness. She wasn't ready to give up, and neither was John. He supported her as best as he could and made his way back to the horse, guiding the woman's limp body toward it. The little girl's face had stayed with him, her fear, her determination. He couldn't fail her now. As he moved, he heard the girl's voice once more, faint but full of hope. "Please help my mom." John couldn't let her down. He managed to get the woman onto the horse, her head resting against his shoulder. With one hand supporting her, he mounted the horse and began the journey back to the ranch. It was a long ride, the distance between the cabin and the ranch feeling farther than ever before. He kept his eyes focused on the path ahead, but his mind was on the woman he carried with him and the little girl waiting for him at the ranch. The sky darkened even further as he rode, and the cold began to creep in, but John didn't stop. His thoughts remained sharp, even as the hours seemed to stretch on. The woman in his arms was still alive, but barely. He had to keep pushing forward. He couldn't fail her. The ranch came into view, and John breathed a sigh of relief. He would make it. He would get the woman to safety. His ranch was quiet, a place where no one could hurt her anymore. It would be a sanctuary, a place where she could heal, away from whatever hell she had endured. He dismounted and carefully helped the woman down from the horse. She was weak, but she still clung to him, her small, fragile hands gripping his arm for support. John led her inside the ranch house, where the warmth of the fire greeted them. The little girl was waiting anxiously by the door, her eyes wide with worry. As soon as the girl saw her mother, her face lit up with relief. She ran to her side, her tiny arms wrapping around her mother's waist. The woman groaned but managed to smile weakly, touching her daughter's hair in gratitude. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. John nodded, though he was too exhausted to speak. He helped her to a chair by the fire and began to tend to her injuries. The little girl stood by, watching him with trust in her eyes. John knew that trust was something he couldn't break. He worked as quickly as he could, cleaning and dressing the woman's wounds, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. While he worked, the woman's breathing steadied, though she remained unconscious. Her body was still fragile, but she was alive. Alive because of the little girl's courage, because of the strength she had shown by coming to John for help. When John finished, he stepped back and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief settle in his chest. They were safe now. The woman and her daughter had found a place where they could heal, and that was all that mattered. John stood at the doorway, looking out at the quiet ranch. He had saved them, but he had also found something he didn't know he had been looking for. He had found purpose. As he turned back to the woman and the girl, he made a promise to them. He would never let anyone hurt them again. They would rebuild, together. And with that thought, John knew that his life would never be the same.